Welcome. Welcome to TechSphere. Thanks for tuning in. Today, we're going to be tackling a database dilemma that's probably crossed every developer's mind at one point or another.
Oh, yeah.
When should you use a JSON field
Right.
instead of creating a separate relational table?
It's a classic debate, one that can lead to some pretty heated discussions in my experience.
Oh, tell me about it.
Yeah.
I might have a slight tendency to reach for JSON a bit too quickly sometimes.
Yeah.
And let's just say it doesn't always make everyone happy.
Let's just say I appreciate a little bit more structure when it comes to data.
Yeah.
But hey, that's what this deep dive is all about, right? Helping you navigate this decision.
Exactly.
Like a pro.
So today, we're going to walk you through a couple of real-world scenarios from our own experience.
Yeah.
Hopefully, by the end of this, you'll have a solid mental framework for making this call in your own projects.
Absolutely.
Now, before we jump into the specifics,
Sure.
let's make sure everyone's on the same page. When we talk about relational tables, what are we talking about?
So think of it like a classic spreadsheet.
All right.
You've got rows, which represent individual records.
Right.
And columns, which hold specific types of data.
Okay.
And these tables can be linked together using foreign keys to create relationships between different pieces of information.
Right.
It's a very structured, organized way to store data.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So where does JSON fit into all this?
So JSON, or JavaScript Object Notation, offers a more flexible way to store data.
Okay.
It's like a container that can hold various data types, like strings, numbers, arrays,
Right.
even other JSON objects.
So it's like having mini databases within your database.
Yeah.
Kind of like those Russian nesting dolls,
Yeah.
but for data.
That's a good analogy. And while this flexibility can be incredibly useful, it can also lead to some, shall we say, unintended consequences if not used carefully.
Right. It can get a bit messy.
Exactly.
Like you're not careful.
And it's important to understand both the strengths and weaknesses of JSON.
Yeah.
Before you commit to using it in your database.
Okay, so with that foundation laid, let's dive into our first real-world example.
Let's do it.
All right, picture this. You're building a system to handle configuration options for different companies.
Okay.
Each company can tweak various settings,
Right.
like toggling features on or off, setting limits, and so on. We're talking at least 10 different options.
Okay.
But most companies probably won't need to change most of them.
Right.
Now, my initial instinct in this scenario might be to go with a JSON field.
Okay.
It just seems like the easiest way to accommodate all those potential customizations.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, it's certainly tempting to go for that flexibility, right?
Right.
But before we jump to conclusions,
Yeah.
we need to consider a few things.
Sure.
First, how often are these configuration options likely to change?
Yeah.
And are we talking about simple key value pairs? Or could we end up with companies needing completely different sets of options?
Oh, okay.
The shape of the data, as we call it,
Yeah.
can really influence this decision.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And in this specific case, there was another wrinkle.
Okay.
The system had default configurations defined in the code,
Right.
and the database object would only store overrides.
Okay.
So if a company didn't customize a specific option, it would just inherit the system default.
Right.
How does that factor into the decision?
That definitely adds another layer of complexity.
Yeah.
Now, we're not just storing data. We also need to manage that logic of defaults and overrides.
Right.
It's important to think about how that will be implemented and maintained, whether you choose JSON or a relational table.
Okay, so already we're seeing there's no simple answer here.
Yeah.
It's about carefully considering the specific context and needs of the project.
Absolutely.
But hold on, before we reveal what we actually did in this scenario,
Okay.
let's throw another example into the mix. One where, at first glance, JSON might seem like the obvious choice,
Right.
but where a relational table actually ended up being the better fit.
Ooh, I like where this is going.
All right, imagine we need to let users customize the labels
Okay.
for different fields in the application. Instead of seeing the system default label,
Right.
a company could choose to display something more specific to their workflow.
Okay.
On the surface, a JSON field seems like a quick and easy solution.
Yeah, I can see why you'd think that.
Right.
It seems like a very straightforward way to handle it.
Exactly.
Ah.
But I have a feeling you're about to tell me why that's not the best approach. What am I missing?
Well, in this case, we already had several features in the app that used a full CRED interface, create, read, update, delete
Wow.
with separate tables to manage similar types of customizations.
So consistency played a big role in this decision.
Absolutely. Consistency makes the application more predictable,
Right.
both for developers and users. It also simplifies maintenance and reduces the chances of introducing bugs.
Right.
Plus, using a separate table gave us more flexibility for future expansion.
Oh.
We could easily add functionality to let companies create entirely new fields
Oh,
with custom labels if needed.
So thinking about future-proofing is key here.
Yeah.
I have to admit that's not always my strongest suit.
Right.
I tend to get caught up in solving the immediate problem.
Well, that's why having different perspectives on a team is so valuable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I think we've laid some good groundwork here.
Okay.
Let's shift gears and talk about some key takeaways.
Okay.
Instead of hard and fast rules, think of these as guiding principles
Right.
to help you navigate this JSON versus relational table dilemma.
Okay, so what's the first thing developers should consider?
One of the most important questions is how central this data is
Mm-hmm.
to the application's core functionality.
Okay.
Think of it this way. If changing this data
Yeah.
would significantly impact how the app works, a relational table might be a safer bet.
Okay.
It offers more structure and control,
Mm-hmm.
like building a solid foundation for your house.
Makes sense, yeah.
You don't want the whole house to come crumbling down
Right.
if you make a small change to the data.
Exactly.
On the other hand, if the data is more peripheral
Right.
or less critical, a JSON field might be perfectly suitable.
Right.
Think of it as adding a flexible extension to your house.
Okay.
You can adapt it as needed
Mhm.
without risking the structural integrity of the whole building.
It's about understanding the impact of that data
Right.
and choosing the appropriate level of structure.
Exactly.
What else should we keep in mind?
We touched on this earlier, but
Yeah.
consistency is key.
Right.
If you already have similar features in your app using relational tables,
Mm-hmm.
it often makes sense to stick with that pattern.
Okay.
You don't want your code base to become a Frankenstein's monster
Yeah.
of different approaches. Keep it clean, keep it consistent.
I can definitely see how that would make things easier to maintain in the long run.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Another key factor is the size and complexity of the data you're storing.
Right.
How many items are we talking about and how complex is the structure?
Oh.
Relational databases are optimized for handling large data sets and performing complex queries.
Okay.
So if you have a lot of data
Right.
or need to search and filter based on specific values within the data,
Right.
a relational table might be a better fit.
So if it's a smaller data set
Yeah.
with a relatively simple structure, a JSON field might be a more lightweight option.
Exactly. It really comes down to finding the right tool for the job.
Right.
And let's not forget about those pesky future requirements.
Yeah.
Try to anticipate how the data might evolve.
Right.
Could new fields be added?
Okay.
Might the relationships between data points change?
Okay.
If so, a relational table often gives you more room to grow.
It's like planning for your family to expand. You wouldn't want to buy a 2-bedroom house if you're thinking about having 5 kids.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now remember, we're not talking about hard and fast rules here,
Okay.
but more about a thought process,
Oh,
like
yeah.
mental framework
Yeah.
to guide you in making these decisions.
Right. It's not about blindly following a checklist,
Right.
but understanding the underlying principles and applying them to each unique situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to challenge your initial assumptions.
Right.
What seems like the obvious solution at first
Yeah.
might not be the best one in the long run.
I'm definitely guilty of that. But hey, that's how we learn and grow, right?
Absolutely. It's all about continually evaluating and refining our approaches
Yeah.
as we gain more experience.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we've talked a lot about the technical considerations,
Okay.
but there's one more thing I want to emphasize.
What's that?
Performance.
Right.
We briefly mentioned it earlier,
Yeah.
but it's worth digging a little deeper. Choosing the right data storage approach
Right.
can have a significant impact on the performance of your application.
Right. Because ultimately, we want our applications to be fast and responsive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how does this relate to JSON versus relational tables?
Okay.
Well, if you're frequently searching for specific values within a JSON field,
Right.
it can be much slower
Oh, okay.
than querying a well-indexed relational table.
So if we're doing a lot of searching and filtering,
Right.
a relational table might be the way to go.
In many cases, yes.
Okay.
Relational databases are designed to handle those kinds of operations efficiently.
Right.
They allow you to create indexes, which are like tables of contents for your data,
Right.
making it much faster to find what you're looking for.
Okay.
JSON fields, on the other hand,
Yeah.
often require more complex queries
Right.
that can put a strain on your database.
So performance is definitely something to keep in mind, especially for applications that handle a lot of data or require fast response times.
For sure.
Now, I'm curious, in that configuration options example we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
did performance play a role in your final decision?
Well, it definitely did play a role, but it wasn't the deciding factor in this particular case.
Okay.
Remember, we had about 10 different options.
Right.
Most companies would probably stick with the defaults,
Yeah.
and we needed to manage that logic of merging defaults and overrides.
Right. And my gut instinct was to reach for JSON,
Yeah.
but you seemed hesitant.
Well, it wasn't a clear-cut case.
Okay.
We had to weigh the pros and cons carefully.
Right.
On the one hand,
Yeah.
a JSON field offered that flexibility to store those configurations
Yeah,
in a simple nested format.
Right.
It made managing those default values and overrides pretty straightforward.
Right.
Plus, the data set wasn't huge, and we weren't anticipating a ton of complex queries against those configurations.
So the performance concerns weren't a major factor in this case.
Exactly.
Okay.
And on the other hand, using a relational table would have forced us to create a more rigid structure,
Right.
potentially with multiple tables to handle the relationships between companies' configuration options and default values.
Yeah.
That could have made the code more complex and harder to maintain.
So you opted for simplicity and flexibility.
In this specific scenario, yes.
Okay.
We decided to go with the JSON field.
Interesting. So it's a perfect example of how there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Right.
You really have to analyze each situation
Yeah.
and choose the approach that best fits the context.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And sometimes that means going against your initial instincts.
Right.
Or what might be considered the conventional wisdom. It's all about making informed decisions
Yeah.
based on the specific needs of your project.
Well, I think this has been a super helpful deep dive.
Yeah, me too.
Hopefully our listeners now have a better understanding of when to use JSON fields versus relational tables in their own work.
Absolutely.
And remember, it's not about memorizing rules,
Right.
but developing that critical thinking mindset.
For sure.
Analyze the problem, weigh the pros and cons, and choose the approach that best aligns with your project goals.
Great advice.
And hey, if you're ever on the fence about it, don't be afraid to reach out to a fellow developer or database expert for a second opinion.
Absolutely. Two heads are always better than one, especially when it comes to tricky technical decisions.
Okay, before we wrap things up, I have one final thought-provoking question for our listeners.
Hit me with it.
We've talked about the flexibility of JSON and the structure of relational tables.
Right.
But what about the long-term implications? How might choosing one approach over the other impact your project down the road?
Yeah, good question.
Could it make it harder to adapt to new requirements or scale your application?
Right.
Food for thought.
Yeah, definitely something to think about.
We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences.
Absolutely.
Feel free to share them on our social media channels.
And who knows, your insights might even spark a whole new episode of TechSphere.
Huge thanks to all our amazing listeners for tuning in. We hope you found this deep dive insightful and engaging.
Thanks, everyone.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your fellow tech enthusiasts.
Yep, spread the word.
Until next time, keep on learning, keep on coding, and keep on diving deep into the fascinating world of technology.